go ahead and introduce our wonderful keynote here. Mr. Ira Winkler is a CISSP and President of Secure Mentem and author of Advanced Persistent Security and the forthcoming book, which I'm sure he'll talk about. You can stop stupid. Great title. He is considered one of the world's most influential security professionals and has been named modern day James Bond by the media. He did this by performing espionage simulations where he physically and technically broke into some of the largest companies in the world, investigating crimes against them and telling them how to cost effectively protect their information and computer infrastructure. He continues to perform these espionage simulations as well as assisting organizations in developing cost effective security programs. Ira also won the Hall of Fame Award from the ISSA, that's right, the International Information Systems Security Association, as well as several other prestigious industry awards. Most recently, CSO Magazine named Ira a CSO Compass Award winner as the Awareness Crusader. So, with that, I would like to turn it over to our illustrious keynote, Mr. Ira Winkler.
Hi, thanks so much. I appreciate that. And by the way, let's see, I just started a new position. I am now the CISO for a company called Skyline Technology Systems, primarily. Anyway, talk about that later. But I haven't had a chance. It's been so recent that I haven't had a chance to change my slides. So do want to give them the credit they deserve, as they are now paying me a salary. You can't argue with that. So anyway, I'm trying to bring this up, and let's see, share. Let's see how it comes up. And it should be in full screen mode. Let me know if it's not. So anyway, let's talk about the concept of human security engineering, because this has been, frankly, one of my, I've been evolving how I've been thinking about what I call the human problem, because, when I started out doing I started out commercially, like inside the government. I was obviously doing technical work when I worked at NSA, and we were doing, not necessarily a lot of human elicitation in there, but lots of, technical exploitation of systems, communications, and so on. But as I started getting involved, frankly, the first job I ever had was well, in the commercial sector, was a social engineering simulation where I barely knew what social engineering meant. It was something I saw one day on the news. And when they asked me if I could make a phone call and, make a few phone calls, and 3 days later by calling people up random, well, there was a science to it that I applied, but by calling people up, I had full control over one of the world's largest investment banks. And that was kind of fun. And I wrote about that. And people would start coming to me, and they would say things like, Ira, okay, do your simulations from now on and then come and tell us. And I would do that, and I would think, wow, this is the best awareness ever. The reality, though, is I look back at it now, and I thought it was great at the time. But when I look back at it, and this is the problem with a lot of people doing social engineering, I'm not trying to single anybody out, but when you have social engineering tests done, usually the results come back and say, here's what we did, tell people not to fall for it. I went in a locked door, locked the door. Here's the problem. It's kind of like breaking a light bulb and then saying, wow, you broke the light bulb really well. Now fix the light bulb. Or even a better example I like to use lately, and that's if you stab somebody. And it's like, if somebody stabs someone and then you stab it, they're like, wow, they stabbed them really well. You know what the punishment should be? The punishment should be that person should perform surgery to fix the damage they caused. And, when you think about it, because it's really easy to take a tool or go up to a person individually and create damage in theory, the hard part is fixing it. And if you work inside a large organization, the reality of the situation is you guys need to understand that just because somebody can exploit a vulnerability, it doesn't mean they can fix the vulnerability in a consistent, repeatable way within the limitations that an organization not just theoretically has, but actually has. Because just telling somebody, oh, hackers are going to call you up and ask for your password, don't give them your password, that doesn't work. It works a significant portion of the time to a certain extent, but it doesn't work all the time, which is what you need. And I've been refining this concept for decades now. And I've come, and as you're going to see as I go by, the problem isn't that bad guys can break something. The problem is that it's infinitely harder to fix the problem in a consistent way. And let me move on from that. Let's see, how do I have to do this? Okay, so I'll do it that way. So let's talk about the first one is Twitter. And this was a very recent attack where obviously, the some criminal mastermind, as the media portrayed them, was able to essentially get into Twitter remotely and get access to the administrative systems, which then allowed for changing of passwords or resetting of passwords. This criminal mastermind then went ahead and sold access to those accounts that he changed passwords to. And then they went ahead and used the compromised accounts to solicit Bitcoin transactions. Now, again, the mastermind turned out to be 17 years old, and I kind of laugh about that. Because these days, again, we're right in the middle of a presidential election where it's acknowledged you have Russia, China, Iran, probably Israel, probably a dozen other countries that are out there in one way or another trying to protect their interests, if not outright manipulation. And you stop and think about it, and you hear 17-year-old mastermind. I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets when I say, having worked at NSA among other intelligence organizations around the world, there's probably a bunch of people who are more highly skilled than a 17-year-old in their basement. So when you hear about this 17-year-old mastermind randomly calling people up to get access, you got to admit there's probably other people who have gotten as far, if not further, in doing the exact same things. In all likelihood, and I hate to give this person any credit because I don't think it was intentional, but in all likelihood, the issues that were identified because of this probably closed a few holes that foreign intelligence agencies were in the process of exploiting anyway. But let's talk about exactly what happened. Was this a mastermind? No, it was a guy who just happened to have the time and effort and inclination to sit there and call people up. And I will give some credit in having essentially the focus and figuring out, how do I go ahead and access these tools, and calling people up and finding out little bits of information here or there, then figuring out who in theory has access, which pretty much 20% of Twitter had access, according to all the statistics. And that's obviously a very bad thing to begin with as well. And then they just conducted phishing attacks, and they probably attempted to compromise, and they did, compromise multi-factor authentication. It probably did take advantage of people working from home during the pandemic, which again probably filtered out some security protocols. But again, really what they did was they set up some fake sites that allowed for a collection of credentials, which they then replayed to log in as the people compromised. They accessed the admin tools and so on. Now you stop and think about this, and I'm going to probably cut a little bit into my presentation because this is really just setting it up at the same time. But at the same time, why did 1,000 people have access? And then simultaneously stop and think. You had somebody like President Obama, Obama's account that was compromised. Obama's account, I think, had 120 million followers. You shouldn't have a random admin who was able to go ahead and reset a password on an account with 120 million people. I don't know how many people remember this, but somebody hacked President Trump's account 2 years ago and basically deleted the account. Now, what I mean by hacked, and I shouldn't say hacked, it was a German contractor who was on his last day, and as his parting gift, he deleted President Trump's account. Now, that's a sign that somebody inside would do something malicious by choice, let alone an outsider accessing insider privileges because of this. So Twitter should have been on the alert, which they weren't. Now, let's talk about pretty much what I would consider the opposite. Actually, let me continue on Twitter. Twitter the biggest most heinous part of the Twitter thing was they described it as a sophisticated social engineering attack. And, I look at that, or no, a sophisticated phishing attack, which they weren't really even sure what exactly was happening in how they described it at the time. And the reality was, it wasn't just an attack against phishing. It wasn't, they said how they're going to improve awareness. Improving awareness was one tactic to use. But again, why did 1,000 people have access? Why was there any single random individual among 1,000 who would have been able to essentially delete President Obama's account, as an example, and so on? Now, moving back, keeping that in mind, let's talk about Cloudflare. Around the same time this happened, there was a serious outage of Cloudflare. And they did an investigation. And then I forgot the name, the guy, I think his name was Matt Prince, who's CEO of Cloudflare. He, not a random security engineer in Twitter who put out their official notices, but Matt Prince, or whoever the CEO is of Cloudflare, was tweeting out what was happening. And at one point he tweeted out the root problem. Again, the root of the failure at Cloudflare was the result of an engineer mistyping entries into, I think it was a routing table or some type of table. It was essentially a typo that took down their whole network. And somebody replied back to him, said, I would hate to be that engineer. And, there's Cloudflare does good, Cloudflare does bad, but Matt Prince got my respect immensely because he tweeted out almost immediately in reply to the comment that I would hate to be that engineer, was it's not the engineer's fault. It was a failure of leadership. The title on this slide, A Failure of Leadership, is his quote, because he said fundamentally, a single engineer should not be enabled to take down our entire network like it was. And that you have to give the guy a lot of credit for, not just thinking and believing, but actually saying publicly. And we need that type of response every time there is some sort of incident that involves a user that's responsible at the proximity. So let's talk about this, because essentially what Twitter did was they applied what in safety science you'd call old school safety science. In old school safety science, and the reason I'm frankly shocked, we keep hearing people talk about mental models in cybersecurity and awareness and everything else. The fact we're not talking about safety science is a failure of cybersecurity visionaries, for lack of a better term. And safety science is a, you barely hear about it, but it's a critical role inside organizations. Every time there's an injury, every time something happens on a factory floor, every time there millions of dollars of outage result from injuries or whatever else, safety science people go in there and figure out why the problem happened and look to save the organization's millions of dollars in lawsuits, in outages, or whatever the cause may be. And the old school way of doing it was they always looked in and say, why did that user do what they do? Why did that user get injured? And they always focused on the proximity of the error. In other words, one example was, when doctors would go ahead and doctors would make an error in diagnosing a patient, they would go and say, why did that doctor make that error? And then when people started studying it, the error the doctor made in theory was not a result of that one action, but it was the result of thousands of potential actions along the way, probably hundreds of potential actions. It doesn't matter. It's not where the proximity happened. It's what led to that error happening that was more the reason. But in old school safety science, it was just like, why did that user at that time do what they do? And basically, it was an analysis of why the user was wrong fundamentally. New school safety science, they go back and say, hey, that's like saying if a canary dies in a coal mine, the solution was a healthier canary. That obviously is not the case. The purpose of a canary in a coal mine is for the canary to die if there's poisonous gas, as an example. Much like in cybersecurity, the result is a user makes a mistake, like somebody like the criminal mastermind sophisticated social engineered that Twitter user, and they're like, we just need a more aware user. Again, do you give your canary a gas mask? With new school safety science, the concept is that the error is just a symptom of a failure of the entire system. Much like the Twitter hack, that response was a failure of the entire system. Like when I mentioned Cloudflare having that one error that cascaded into a major catastrophe. That was a failure of the system. That's new school safety science. And besides, you don't want to have unhealthy canaries that might just drop dead. You want somebody who's reasonably healthy to behave as is. You don't want them to create artificially better things, which is impossible. So let's look at operational problems. And again, here's the thing. Proximity doesn't explain a lot. When you have mechanical breakdowns, so for example, if you have a car that all of a sudden breaks down, is it just because the car broke down? Oh, it's this? No, it's probably a systematic issue. I mentioned medical postmortems as well, where one bad action results from hundreds of complex decisions along the way. New school safety science, the user is as much a part of the system as the computer is. Because right now we just look at this computer as an inanimate object. And frankly, I'll be upfront with you, as a person who's worked the human aspects of security for so long, you need to understand that the user is really just a part of your system. And frankly, when you look at it, there's a reason the human resources department is called human resources. Some companies now call it the people office or whatever. But the reality is, from a business perspective, people who work in your organization are a part of the organizational system. And that's how you have to look at things from a safety science perspective and cybersecurity perspective. And in doing so, from cybersecurity or safety science, you have to look at all the enabling factors, such as how did the user come to be the proximity of the error? Why was the user in the position? But again, the action itself was a symptom. And again, especially in cybersecurity, the user error is really just a symptom of what's wrong with everything. And I'll talk about a few things. So let me try to, give you an example. The Boeing 737 MAX jets, these are 737 MAX jets. And when the planes crashed, everybody was looking at, why did the pilots steer the planes into the ground? Or even if it was the autopilots, why didn't the pilots take control? And everybody's like, oh, it must be the pilots. Then after a while, they started thinking, oh, let's look at this. And, they realized they can't just keep blaming the pilots. But fundamentally, they said, hey, wait a second. The pilots could have saved the plane. On other planes that had the same problems, the pilots were able to save the planes, but these two pilots couldn't. So theoretically, yes, the pilots could have saved the planes. The reality, though, was the errors that caused this crash was not necessarily the errors of the pilots. What happened was, when they started designing the 737 MAX, which was for all practical purposes almost identical to the 737 200, 300, 800, 900 series planes, it was essentially the same. So they didn't think the pilots needed any special training, and that was critical. But what happened was, another critical thing that happened was on airplanes, there's these AOAs, they're called angle of attacks, which essentially are monitoring airspeed and angle of the planes. Like, is the plane going down or is the plane going up? And what happened was, on the old 737 jets, the older, if there was a discrepancy, like one said it's going down, another said it's going up, they would warn the pilot and say there's a discrepancy and tell the pilot essentially to take over. But in the 737 jets, what happened in the MAX jets, they said, hey, you know what, that warning indicator, that's an option. We're going to charge people extra for that. And guess what? A few airlines did not want to pay extra for that, that warning alarm, nor were they even encouraged as to how bad the problem could theoretically be if it happened. So the other part is that when a plane is essentially going down and it's not supposed to, the way a plane is supposed to go back up is by picking up speed. And the way a plane picks up speed is to angle downward. And when it angles downward, it goes faster for obvious reasons. And then that should generate more lift in the wings. But at some point, as the plane started going faster, they didn't indicate that the planes would be going up, which they were in theory, and they angled the planes down even more. And that's what essentially led to the problem. Simultaneously, the pilots did not get any special training. There was possibly a comment buried in a document because the pilots supposedly didn't need to take special training. They were just given documents to read as far as what might be minorly different from one plane to the other. And that created another set of issues. So anyway, when you look at why did these planes crash? They crashed because of decisions and actions that were taken years before beyond the visibility, or even pilots would think, who would make this an option? Beyond the visibility and beyond the comprehension of why this was happening for the pilot, which happened years before. So anyway, in cybersecurity, the reality is it's not you when you start thinking, oh, gee, it's like the user this, the user that. We have been fed a bunch of crap for years, for decades. All of a sudden, we hear about people creating the human firewall. You hear about your users being your last line of defense, your first line of defense, and so on. I use the term bro science. If you've ever worked out in one, different gyms, they have like the bros in the gym, like eat your protein, bro, do more squats, bro, do whatever, bro. And all these people are like, they're just like spreading, I guess you call it old wives' tales. Well, if you really want to do this, and they do. Why did they say that? Because that's what the person before them said. And they think it works because the person before them said it, and so on. And you never know where it came from. But again, the human firewall is one of these things. The vendors are shoving those terms down your throat. Normal firewalls suck. Why would you want a human one? Then, your last line of defense, that's another term I hear a lot. Frankly, if your security program relies upon the user as the last line of defense, you should be fired quickly. And let me discuss why. It's not just a buzz phrase, because the fact of the matter is, if the user is the final determination of what could cause harm and what could not cause harm, you've got to take into consideration, even beyond the fact that users will make mistakes, you've got to consider that 4% of users are sociopaths or psychopaths no matter what. That's just a statistical fact. And these people will cause you harm if given the opportunity and inclination to do so at any time. And if you're leaving your line of defense, your last line of defense is the user, you are in serious trouble and you deserve to be fired. Now, again, but either way, all of these are focusing on the proximity of the user. In other words, a user makes a mistake, we just need a more aware user. We need funnier videos, even funnier videos than that if it's not working. But that's saying the proximity of the error is the problem, and that's so far from the truth. Now, anyway, hopefully you all recognize Newman. The reason I show Newman on this is actually irrelevant because Newman is just Newman. I just needed a cool picture to show accounting. And why do I show accounting? Because if you stop and think about it, the accounting process is implemented by a CFO, CFO or similar position. And their job is essentially to ensure there's good financial processing from start to finish inside an organization, possibly one of the most critical aspects of an organization as a whole. Now, stop and think about this. What would happen if a CFO walked into a board meeting and said, hey, we had a $20 million issue happen because some user made a mistake? They would be firing that CFO before he finished that user made a mistake. And the reason is that a CFO's primary job, like I said, is to ensure financial stability, financial processing within the organization. And that processing from start to finish includes people throughout the entire process. Think about this. All of you are inside an organization, and many of you, if not most of you, have to create time cards. If you do not fill out your time card or whatever the equivalent is correctly, you will not be paid. people don't say, oh, but we can't blame the user. We can't go. No, they blame you. If you do not fill out your time card, that is part of your job responsibility and you do not get paid. Likewise, I travel, I work for organizations and so on, and they want to see receipts for every charge. And I am annoyed by that, but I do it because you know what? There was one time where I had a trip to San Francisco. It was a long trip, so I had an expensive plane ticket. I had expensive hotel bills, probably a $3,000 plus voucher for reimbursement, and I forgot my $4.63 Frappuccino receipt. Nobody ever said, oh, but we can't be unfair to Ira. It's only $4.63. You know what? I had to find that. I had to print up my credit card statement and basically copy that and submit that because they required a receipt for every expense. And do I blame them? Well, fraud is excess charging on expense vouchers was probably a problem at some point in time that adds up to a lot for a large organization. So they implemented policies like this. And nobody ever says it's unfair to a user to force them to implement the policies. So think about that. Accounting, another process inside an organization, heavily reliant upon every user in the organization, basically sets fundamental requirements. And we're afraid to do that in cybersecurity. Here's a picture of, well, this picture is supposed to, what I perceive to be a scuba diving certification class. And a lot of people don't know, I'm a master scuba diver trainer. And I can certify people. I'm certified by PADI and all that sort of stuff. Hopefully, I'll be able to dive sometime after everybody figures out this whole thing out. But in this class, the first time I ever heard the expression, you can't, C-A-N apostrophe T, stop stupid, was when I was taking my dive instructor certification course. And the course director said, oh, you can't stop stupid. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? Our whole course is here to stop stupid. We're not here to stop stupid from existing. We're here to stop stupid from creating a problem. We know there will be stupid. Diving is ironically statistically safer than bowling is. And that's fascinating to me at a large extent because there are countless ways you can theoretically kill yourself in diving. But yet the whole process, because of all the dive organizations, has effectively stopped stupid, where people are generally healthy when they dive and they know how not to kill themselves. Because think about this, before we would take on students, inside like an actual course and take them underwater, first they had to complete about, give or take, 100 hours of training, mostly safety procedures. Then we would then they would come, they'd be tested online. We then test them again to make sure they didn't have somebody else take the class, because that happens. And then we go ahead, test them to see they actually know the stuff. Then before we put them in the water, underwater, we make sure they're not going to freak out in the water. We make them do basically a float test for a while and then see if they could swim like 200 yards or whatever that number is at the moment. Not because we really care how well they swim, but because we just care they're not going to freak out. Then before we put them in basic shallow water for the first time, we check out all the equipment. We see that they look reasonably healthy. And then we go ahead and they let them put on the equipment in the shallow, get in the shallow end, you see if they're comfortable, then slowly take them down to the deeper end. Then hopefully train them in skills over 3 or 4 sessions. Then before we actually certify them, we take them first of all off the facilities insured, the school is insured, the dive instructor is insured like me. We know where all the hospitals are. We know where the barometric chambers are and all that sort of stuff. And then we take them where it's not deeper than 30 feet. Usually a platform like this is not going to be deeper than 15 feet and so on. And then I'm supposed to certify up to 8 people at a time and watch one at a time and that they can demonstrate their skills. Now, clearly, that would be stupid on my part to say, I'm going to watch all 8 people while I certify one at a time. So in general, you don't see back there, but a smart dive instructor takes along with him an assistant instructor or a dive master to watch the people he can't and stay there and observe just in case somebody does something stupid, for lack of a better term. So in general, when you look at things from a safety science perspective, where does the blame usually come from? Whose fault is it? 90% of the time, the blame for a user action goes to the environment. And when I say that, in a physical world, I was once doing an awareness program for a large manufacturing organization, and I was walking around with the safety officer, and the safety officer was telling me as we were walking around the warehouse, he's like, we had a few dozen accidents in this warehouse alone where we had people who were being hit by forklifts. And then we figured out it was costing us millions of dollars. We went through everything. And then what we did was we determined, went through every option. And then we finally figured, hey, let's go ahead and paint lines on the floor and basically say there's a roadway on one side, people go on the other side. And he's like, that took care of almost every one of those dozen issues we had for years up till this point. He's like, the accidents we had that remained were due to people potentially on their cell phones walking down and wandering into the roadway, or the forklift drivers or whoever, accidentally veering off because they weren't paying attention. And then it wasn't just there, but think about this. In a user environment, and I'm not saying this is, if a phishing message gets to the user and a user clicks on it, whose fault is that? Everybody says, oh, user. No, how did the phishing message get to the user? You have essentially handed that message to the user and to evaluate as part of their ongoing work. That is your fault. The environment has given them a user experience which lent itself to that. Now, maybe a user is going to make a mistake. I don't know about you, but I have accidentally clicked on the wrong button, not even because I made a mistake, but because the screen, the graphics card was being delayed in some way, shape, or form, and the cursor was not in the right position and clicked on the wrong thing, even though it was visually to me clicking on the right thing. So again, 90% is the user experience, the environment. Only 10% statistically is the user's fault. Now, that 10% could be carelessness. In other words, they know what to do, but they just don't do it. Could be blatant ignorance. Ignorance means unknowing, and it could be a lot of unknowing. It could be a lack of training. It could be outright malice. Never forget, malice is an option on the part of users. So anyway, this is where the awareness might fit in, but even this is just 10% of the potential problem. Frankly, the big lesson out of this is just so I reiterate this and where I'm going anyway, 90% is in your hands. It's not in the user hands if you want to mitigate user problems. But here's a concept out of applied behavioral science, the ABCs of applied behavioral science. A stands for antecedent, because saying information, IBC is a disease. It's not as catchy as ABC. But anyway, antecedent, you're essentially providing information to a user to attempt to get them to improve a behavior. The behavior itself then generates a consequence. The consequence itself then goes back and influences that behavior, almost as a form of awareness itself. Now, the reality is that providing people with information is only going to solve 20% of the problem. The consequences create 80% of behavior, because your goal of an awareness program is essentially to get people to behave in the way you want them to behave securely. But the reality is, and I'm just going to quickly go through this, but we keep telling our users, never reuse your personal passwords, or never reuse passwords to begin with, but especially never reuse personal passwords on business accounts. And then what happens when a user does that? We tell them that, but really they do that behavior. What's the consequence? The reality is you never know when they reuse their passwords. You might, if you really search the dark web and get that intelligence, but 99.9% of the time, there is no consequence for a user, basically reusing passwords. And that in a turn actually is a positive consequence, because that's one less password for them to remember. So it's a positive consequence not to listen to you. So anyway, consider that. And then when we saw, the only time there is really a negative consequence is when it's figured out. And if you, any of you remember the Ring incident, Ring, the home video cameras and audio cameras and so on, basically what happened was, criminals were taking stolen credentials off of the dark web and just randomly trying to reuse them on Ring accounts. And they would go to the Ring website and to basically feed in the user IDs and captured user IDs and passwords. And they ended up getting into a few accounts, and they were able to talk to children in their bedroom and so on. So keep that in mind. But that was the only negative consequence I've really heard of. So at the same time, let's talk boom, because not only am I trying to get safety science into this concept of human security engineering, but there's a few other ones like counterterrorism that really have some good concepts that we can learn from. And in this case, what I'm saying is the user is boom, because right now, with all the statistics, 90% of all user attacks, or sorry, 90% of all attacks against organizations use the human as the primary attack vector. And obviously not a good thing. So for us, I look at the user as the point of boom, the primary attack vector, boom. And left of boom are the things that happen before the user takes their actions. Right of boom are the things that happen after a user takes the action. Now, boom comes from terrorism. And in terrorism, they kind of basically broken it down into different phases. And in terrorism, clearly, it's a very significant concern that has a lot of thought, and they have different teams doing different things. Unfortunately, in cybersecurity, you guys are pretty much the team for the most part. So, prevention is potentially hunting terrorists down so that they don't exist, figuring out what they're looking at, what they're trying to accomplish. The case in Michigan, for example, where the militia people were trying to go ahead and kidnap the governor. That was a good case of proactive prevention. Protection are essentially like the governor always travels around with guards. So, the governor's potentially at risk. They have guards and so on, and that's good. The Pentagon, for example, before the September 11th attacks, they said, you know what? They weren't planning for an airplane, but they said, we're a potential terrorist target, so let's harden the walls. Let's put more steel in and so on. And while I'm not saying it was great, the Pentagon is the largest office building in the world. And despite that, there were relatively minimum deaths because of the fact that the Pentagon itself underwent a hardening exercise a couple years before the September 11th attack. So it did reduce the damage that the plane caused when it crashed into the building. Then at the point of boom, you might have things like hardened cockpit doors, you have explosive resistant cargo bins and stuff like that in airplanes, as an example. Then in responses, you have to train first responders, for example, to know, like, how do you approach a scenario? And there might be secondary devices that you want to be concerned about. What about poisonous gases? What about, chemical, biological types of things and so on? So you have that. Then you have to figure out, okay, how do we get the hospitals trained? How do we get first responders trained? How do we make sure we have enough hospital beds? Where do we go for overflow? Then how do we get people out of a city, for example, if it might be bad? Or how do we stop bad guys from leaving? So all of these concerns go into prevention, left of boom, then right of boom, response. We need to do that in cybersecurity as well, where boom is the user. Because right now we are focusing that on the proximity, the boom. The user does something, the solution is more awareness, which again, I'm sure you all know how effective that is by now. So anyway, I want to introduce the concept that many of you might, well, if you've heard me before, I've been big on this for the last couple years, but there's user-initiated loss. Because here's the issue, and I came up with this term specifically, because a user, at the end of the day, on your computer systems does not cause damage. A user might initiate a sequence, but for example, if a user deletes a file, the user is not deleting the file. The user is executing a command that might delete if you don't have the appropriate protections on it, if you don't have the appropriate backups for it, and so on. But anyway, this means that the user has to be presented with the opportunity to initiate loss and then do it. And then your systems have to facilitate the loss. And that's the critical thing. Again, maybe somebody compromised the Twitter admin account, but it doesn't mean that admins have unfettered access to change passwords, delete accounts, or so on. So what you want to do is two-phase. First, you want to potentially stop the initiation of the loss by taking the potential for by taking the action away from the user in one way or another, and then by expecting the initiation of a loss and taking away the ability to create the damage itself. So for example, when a phishing message comes in theory, the phishing message, maybe DMARC would prevent the phishing message from reaching the system. And then if it does reach the system, perhaps the email servers with anti-malware and everything take the malicious messages out of the inbox, out of the queue, and so on. But then when it gets to the user, what's the user experience that we can provide the user? Then let's say a user clicks on a message. Just because a user clicks on a message, if they don't have admin privileges, they can't execute and install software, as one example. Maybe they want to give away their credentials, but if you have web content filtering and other types of filtering for, websites, you might be able to stop the user from giving away credentials on a phishing link. Then perhaps, this thing wants to, what's another good one? Maybe it's like a malicious person asking the user to attach a message, and they attach the message. DLP should filter that out as well. So again, even if a user takes an action, it doesn't mean that the action has to be realized. But hopefully, I think I beat that to death, so I will move on. So now going on to left of boom. Left of boom, like I started mentioning, is the concept of preventing the user from being in the position to initiate the loss. If we can take a decision or capability away from the user, that's awesome. I know some people say, no, we need to empower the user more. No, that is not correct. The user is a part of your system, and you need to provide the user with all the capabilities they actually need to do their jobs. Any more than that, any less than that is bad. So anyway, you need to go ahead and figure out what capabilities does the user need and how. Maybe I can take the user out of the picture. For example, McDonald's in many places is installing kiosks, so you're not going to have cashiers in a lot of McDonald's restaurants, which takes away a lot of potential both for harm with cashiers stealing money or cashiers shortchanging people, simultaneously with just making mistakes and taking orders wrong. Now it's on the user, like the actual customer, to put in their order and so on. And then also create a culture. I sometimes tell this story where when I worked at NSA, there was one time where I was using this plotter, and the plotter had a mechanical arm, and I had to basically take my badge off to use it. So I took my badge off. Then one evening while I was working shift work, I had to run out and use the restroom. And while I was in the hallway, a guard stops and he goes, "Where's your badge?" I'm like, "Oh, I guess it's in my office." He's like, "We're going to your office." I go, "You're not allowed in my office." He's like, "I'll wait by the door then." So anyway, what happened was I went back to the office, and then I'm looking around and looking, and then my coworker, after a few moments, goes, "Are you looking for something, Ira?" I'm like, "Where's my effing badge?" And he's like, "You mean the badge that should be around your neck at the moment?" I'm like, "Give me my badge." And I just started screaming. The guard's like, do you think I ever forgot that badge again? That culture created the consequences that reinforced the wearing of the badge. Yes, I can curse this guy to this day, 3 decades later, but I still have this story to tell, and it was such an important lesson. Anyway, more important, governance. All too frequently in the cybersecurity industry, we look at governance as, a stack of documents that goes on the shelf. Governance should be, how does the organization perform their jobs? How does the organization run? What is the purpose and job flow of every individual in the organization? And people laugh at me. It's like, "Oh, you expect us?" Yes, cybersecurity should embed good cybersecurity protocols into operational governance. I mean, think about it this way. When you're inside an organization for financial stuff, there is a detailed process of going through and getting approval for financial transactions. Who's allowed to have purchase authority? Where do purchases have to go through? What's the approval sequence? Who and what level of person has what level of approval authority? How are payments supposed to come in? How are invoices supposed to come in? Everything is laid out from start to finish. And we need to start doing that with cybersecurity as well. We need to embed our requirements into operational processes. And I'll talk about that as an example in a bit. But anyway, boom, where are the users presented with the opportunity? Now, in the first place, I don't have on this slide, but we need to think user experience. Are we providing the user with the right guidance as they're, like, for example, approached with a phishing message? Does the phishing message perhaps warn them? This is an external message. Be careful about what you attach to the message, and so on. Are you expecting this, and so on? But we can provide users with good user experiences. Simultaneously, then maybe awareness kicks in to let them figure out, how do they detect it? How do they do it? Do they prevent it? And do they sound the alarm? But remember, the user action at the point of boom could be an accident, it could be careless, willful, malicious, or it could be forced. But either way, here's the consideration. As a cybersecurity professional, in doing your primary job, you don't care why they do it. You just care that a loss at this point is or is not initiated for whatever reason. The reason, frankly, is irrelevant until you go in and investigate at a later point. I also use the expression, and hopefully everybody still remembers Elmer Fudd. If you don't remember, I hate you. But anyway, policies and governance. You really need to go ahead. Sorry, I'm trying to check the time. I see you getting back on. I better look up. But anyway, policies and governance. User actions are very specifically defined. I mentioned this before. The user should know exactly how to do their job. Then we have right of boom. Right of boom, the loss has been initiated. Does the environment expect it? And I beat this to death already. You need to make sure that the environment expects a loss initiation on the part of a user, and provides the protections that stop it. Again, DLP, web content filters, and so on. Most important, go back after an incident happens, like I mentioned they do in the medical profession, like I mentioned they do in safety. Go back and figure out why the incident happened, why the user was in the position to have an incident, why the user incident was realized, and how did you get lucky? Because sometimes accidents stop the damage from being significantly more, perhaps because somebody was not in the right place at the wrong time, or whatever the reason is. But remember, your proximity is not the cause of the incident. The loss being realized is not due to the user. When I have my, I mentioned my book, You Can Stop Stupid. Stupid is not the user. Stupid is user environments that facilitate loss. But anyway, it sounds difficult, but as I mentioned, safety science, accounting, operations do this. And remember, if 90% of all incidents result from the user as the primary attack vector, and you can mitigate that by focusing on the user as your perimeter, for lack of a better term, you'll pretty much get the remaining 10% as well. Let me give this very quick example, Devon, I got you covered. But anyway, left of boom. Boom, let's talk about W-2 fraud. We're approaching W-2 fraud season, assuming we ever have to fill out our tax forms again. And in W-2 fraud, basically a bad person sends a message. They find a low-level HR person to send a message to that says, I'm the CEO of the company. I need you to send the W-2 information out to a new accounting firm. So how can you stop that left of boom? You have mail filtering to filter out spam messages. You tag the message as external as an example. But more important, when you get to the point of boom, the user is sitting there, and the user should not be going, is this the CEO, or is this the wascally wabbit I've been told in my awareness training? The user should never be there thinking, is this, I heard in awareness, there are bad people who are going to try to trick me. That's not what a user should be thinking. A user should be thinking, W-2 information. This is a request for PII related information. A request for PII related information should be handled by the head of HR. So I don't care who this message is from. I'm sending the message to the head of HR, and they then have to figure out from that point what the right process is. And your awareness should be, hey, bad people may want to do things, but your job is to follow the right procedures. The right procedure is you do not send this out yourself. You send it out through somebody. But let's say a user sends out the information anyway, or let's say the head of HR accidentally falls for this or purposely falls for this. DLP software should filter out that attack as well. So again, left a boom boom and right a boom can be handled through PII, but consider the overlap. Handling a PII is this, whether it's W-2 fraud or whatever, can be stop a lot of attacks. DLP itself stops a lot of attacks. Income filtering of messages, anti-spam, anti-malware filters it. All these things filter whatever is there along the way. Now, again, if you can mitigate the 90 by the user attack vector, you probably are going to get a lot of the remaining 10. Now, awareness is still mandatory. People hear my thing and say, oh, you're saying I don't need awareness. No, awareness is a very valid, cost-effective risk reduction tool that needs to be implemented, not just, well, if you're just going to check the box, you're wasting your time, but at least check the box. But if you have a good awareness program in place, users will detect what your technology has failed a good portion of the time. So remember that you still need awareness, even if you have a good environment, because you need a strategy, not random tactics. And again, are you throwing around tactics because, oh, I need a more aware user, I need funny videos, I might need DLP? That is not the solution. Those are random tactics. You need a strategy from start to finish for given user-initiated losses. And remember, safety science is a science. It's a comprehensive strategy. We need to implement sciences not as bro science, but as a strategy in the cybersecurity as we deal with the human issue. Again, most important takeaway, you're not there to make healthier canaries. You're there to stop the systematic issue of your toxic environments that create the damage, that create the death. Everybody should buy my book, You Can't Stop Stupid. Tiny, I create a short link for it just because I want to make it easy for you to get good literature. Anyway, I think I'm done. So I don't know if there's time for questions, but I'll take it.
Um,
Otherwise, I'll thank you all.
oh, that was wonderful, Ira. Um, if you would like, if you want to join our platform, and I'll shoot you the information. If you want to chat with some people there, that would be a great place to, maybe answer some questions if people have them. Um, Unfortunately, we kind of are out of time because there's another session starting.
No
But
problem. Sorry about
no, you don't have to apologize. We started a few minutes late. I just want to thank you for a great presentation, great material. You see all the claps coming in. Please, everybody, give him a
it.
wonderful virtual round of applause. And thank you. The session directly after this one will start as soon as we shut this one down. So give us a minute or two to get set up. And everybody, thank you. Have a good one. Okay, Ira. I will. I'll be in touch, man.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks again for having me. You guys put on an awesome event every year, and I'm glad you really did a great job turning this around so quickly.
Oh no, well, thank you, man. I had a great team, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate you. So y'all go have a good rest of the conference. Okay, bye bye.
Yep, thanks.